one of the things that I think we forget about with God is that there's a shadow, right? Like we talk about, the psalmist talks about the one who dwells under the shadow of the Almighty, right? And so there's this idea of the wing, of God putting his wing around us, or, it's all metaphorical language, obviously, but the idea is that there's a shadow there, and sometimes that's what you need, is a little bit of dark. Okay? This has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today, but it just is. That's also in 2 of those 3 songs. There's this idea of the shadow of God, and how that's still a safe place to be. And so we don't have to always be looking around for there's no light, well, that's fine. Maybe you're in a shadow. That's okay. Because he's the God of the shadow too, right? There's not like some separate thing that happens there. Anyhow, that has absolutely nothing to do with Genesis 1. So I was going to do some shifting today and talk a little bit about Derrida and deconstruction and but then I just kind of decided that's better left to Derridian scholars and teachers because it's a deep, deep, deep subject. But the notion of deconstruction as it has come through Derrida, he's a French theorist who kind of came up with this, and basically the whole idea is to deconstruct a text and a language, is to deconstruct the power structures that are built upon that language and that text. Okay, and so when we take apart certain things, and it applies to biblical criticism as well, we take apart the text and we see what kind of power structures have been built upon these words. And one of them in Genesis is the power structure of the nuclear family being one man, one woman for life, right? Like we think that that's what the text is saying, even though that's not what it says. And so we use that to undergird this power structure called marriage. And we tell other people, well, you can or cannot be married based on how we've interpreted an ancient Hebrew text. So deconstruction helps us in all that. But that said, it also came to be used, and this is how language works, right? We pick a word and we say, well, this is what I'm doing. And we deconstruct. And we deconstruct our faith, and faith should be deconstructed because we're told to test the spirits and to rightly divide the word, and things like this along the way by Jesus and Paul, right? So it's okay to deconstruct in that sense. But I think if we have a good, healthy dose of Derrida up front and learn that deconstruction is all about disassembling these power structures, then we'll be careful to not reassemble new ones when we're done. And this is where I think a lot of people have fallen off the boat because they haven't read Derrida and they don't understand what he's getting at. And so they use the metaphor to deconstruct their faith, and that's great, but then the other side of that is nothing. It's destruction at the end, right? And deconstruction is more about ridding ourselves of unnecessary controlling narrative structures, not creating new ones. Okay, so there's my 5-minute, probably not even 5-minute, 3-minute excursus on Derrida, and if you want to read more, there's all kinds of stuff by him and about him, and you can do no wrong reading Jack Caputo's book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And to talk about, this is what Jesus does with his own text. He takes the Hebrew scriptures and he deconstructs them, and he reuses them, and he repurposes them. Anyhow, so last week we just kind of did an unplanned semi-critical reading, preliminary critical reading of Genesis 1 to 2-3. And I thought this week what I'd do would be plan a little bit better and do a summary of what we talked about last week and then move on and do the same kind of reading but with Genesis 2-3 on with the second creation narrative so that we can kind of see what's going on here. And then we'll make some comments. And then next week I'll come back with some scholarly resources, and we'll talk about what Genesis 1 and 2 sort of tell us. Okay, and I'll get into a little bit of that today, but we'll get the whole picture later. So, just as a review, I don't know if anybody did the homework. I would be very surprised if you did. Genesis 1 begins with the creation of the heavens and the earth. And then it moves on, and it talks about that there is darkness over the deep. And then it moves on and says, but the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Okay? And then there is creation. And during creation, the thing called water is made. So right away, we've got a thing we need to look at here and say, why is it saying the Spirit hovers over the waters if the thing called water has not been created yet? What are these waters that the Spirit is hovering over? Okay, so that's something we should, as we're reading through, just make a note. Highlight it. Say, what are these? Why are these waters here? And we'll talk about why next week, and we'll get into, why they use certain things, okay? And then we have all this creation that happens, and we're going to go into that creation here in just a second. And then after creation, the trees, all of them are called good for food to all things. Specifically, the trees are said, every tree is good for food for everything that lives on the earth. It's a very clear point. Okay, that all trees, not all but two, or all but one, actually. It says all, every. Okay, so that lets us know that they're really, at the time of the creation of the Genesis 1 narrative, the Genesis, or the creation of the Genesis creation story, that means that there, at least at that moment, there is no tree in view that you weren't supposed to eat from. This is a self-contained creation myth. Okay, so they're not dealing with that tree because that's not a part of this myth. Okay, and don't think the word myth means fiction. Okay, the word myth to ancient societies means true but more than literal. Okay, so there's something happened. Folklore comes close in our time because we have some things and we make big stories about them, and that's that. And then at the end of all this, there's the Sabbath and the rest, and that God rested, and there's some ambiguity there. Did he rest in the seventh day? Was he still working till a certain point? Was it 3 p.m. and then he rested, or was it at sunrise on the seventh day? He's boom, it's 100 men, and he and he rests. Now it's time to rest, or and this is why there's rabbinic discussion. Okay. And why, when you get to the Mishnah, which is the rabbinic kind of doctrine book, and it's the first discussion in the Mishnah is about what color the sky is on the Sabbath. Is it orange? Is it black? Is it blue? Is it yellow? And it's Rabbi so-and-so says it's orange. Rabbi so-and-so says it's this shade of blue. Rabbi so-and-so. So there's no answer given, but they're debating. Why? Because they want to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Right? So since Genesis isn't clear, there's debate about when it actually happens. Now. Now it's the Sabbath, okay? So now let's go into the days of creation. This is all just review from Genesis 1. First, there's light and separation, right? Creates the light, separates it from the darkness. Okay, and these are the ideas of light and darkness. These aren't the lights themselves because they come later. Okay, so we can't even say that in the beginning God is in darkness or light because they're not made yet. So it's just God just kind of is there. And this is odd for the ancient Near East. Usually there's a genesis to the deity. Okay, and so God just is kind of there. He isn't born. He's not, he's just there. What is he surrounded by? We don't know, but the Spirit hovers over the chaos. So then he says light and dark. Then he creates a vaulted dome on the first day in the midst of the waters, right? Again, what are those waters? Water hasn't been made yet. Sea hasn't been created yet. So if he's creating a dome, that's in the midst of the chaos from above. Okay, all the chaotic water that the Spirit hovers over, God creates a dome in the midst of that, and he separates waters above from waters below. And then there's the gathering of the waters, which apparently already exist. And then the separation of water and dry ground. And then God creates the plants and seed and reproduction. And then there's the lights in the vaulted dome, and understand that these are lights within the vaulted dome. So we think, that the way that the ancient Hebrew people looked at this is that they actually thought that there were lights within the little dome that covers the earth. Okay? And then the separation of day and night happens with two lights, and we talked about this last time. We know now that the moon is not a light. The moon is a reflection. And so it's not two lights, it's one light which gets reflected at nighttime. Okay? And then the waters swarm. And the dome of the heavens swarms, and there's more reproduction. And then the living creatures are brought forth from the earth, and there's more reproduction. And then human is made in image and likeness to rule over all of the above. And then they all get this command, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Okay, all the animals and humanity gets this command. And so one thing that you can do with Genesis 1, and one thing that I've heard that works well, if you like this kind of thing, is the first 3 days, days 1, 2, and 3, are created areas that are filled by days 4, 5, and 6, respectively. Okay, so the vaulted dome is created on day 1, and the waters are separated. And then on day 4, day 4, the lights are put in the vaulted dome. Okay, and then on day 2, the gathering of the waters, and then day 5, the waters swarm with animals. Okay, and day 3, there's plants and seed and all that, and day 6, living creatures are brought forth. And so it's like it's creation and filling, and creation and filling, and creation and filling. Okay, is kind of the idea in how they've structured this. And this is, for some scholars, they like this approach. Okay, I do. I think it works. It helps with the poetry that Genesis 1 is. It could even be taken as a song if you read it in Hebrew. Okay, so that kind of helps us with some of the basic English critical reading points of Genesis 1. That's a good review. And then quickly, I want to review just some interesting, if not important, Hebrew words that are in this first creation narrative. And I'm not going to say all of them, but there's quite a few. The very first word of the Hebrew Bible is bereshit. And be is the Hebrew word for in or to or toward. And so, or it's ba. And so what they'll say is, most English Bibles say in the beginning, right? But actually, it's not even beginning. It's beginnings plural. The it ending is a plural in Hebrew. And so it could be something more like toward the beginning of things. Like back when God was creating. Okay, and so that's just an interesting way you can take the Hebrew text to mean back toward the beginning, not in the beginning, this isn't necessarily meant to be a step-by-step outline of God creating the world. It's meant to say, hey, whenever this happened, here's how it took place, according to this particular story. Okay, bara, which is the second word, is a theological claim. It's something that only God does in the Hebrew Bible. So he creates. Okay, he baras things. He makes them, but it's not a making out of stuff that he's already created. Okay, it's a creation out of something other than what is already there, and it's not out of nothing. And in Genesis 1, it's always Elohim, is always the God creating. Okay, it's Elohim baraz, God creates. Okay. And then we said last time on the Spirit hovered over the deep. That word is tehum in Hebrew, and that's a Hebrew cognate of Tiamat, which is the Babylonian chaos deity. And then when you get to God creating the seas, the word for sea in Hebrew is Yam, and Yam is also a known Canaanite deity. Okay, he's the god of the sea. And so some of what is happening in Genesis 1 with the language that they're using is them asserting some things about these deities that other nations worship. No, that's not a deity. Our God created that. Okay, so you don't need to worship the sea because the sea isn't a deity. It is controlled by our Elohim. Okay? And the same thing happens with some other of the Canaanite deities. Shemesh is the god of the sun, is the sun god in Canaanite mythology, and Shemesh is the Hebrew word for sun. And so sometimes this stuff happens linguistically, but sometimes it happens as an affront to the deity. Like Israel's doing this on purpose. Okay? Okay, so that's all the review, and now we'll go into reading Genesis 2:3 on until I get tired of talking today. And it's highly likely that this could be a long service, so hunker down. We can order pizza or something. Now, Genesis 2:4 is where we're going to start. I read from the Lexham English Bible, partly because it's linked in my software that I use to all of my Hebrew manuscripts, and I can go through and look at words, but also partly because I like that they translate the name Yahweh, and they put Yahweh instead of the Lord, so that you see everywhere that they talk about Yahweh versus Elohim. And Elohim is the general term God. It doesn't have to be capitalized. It's a category. Okay? It's also used as the name of God for the northern kingdom for a while. And so there's some breakdown in how we talk about why Genesis was written the way it was, and we'll get into that next week, and how the different kingdoms had different stories to tell and different reasons to tell the stories that they told, and why there are two narratives, why they don't agree, why they say different things. So we've read Genesis 1 to 2:3, and we've seen that this is the order of creation, here's how things happened, and man was created last. After everything was made, man was created and put into what was there, right? Then we get to Genesis 2:4, it says, "These are the generations of heaven and earth, when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and heaven, before any plant of the field was on the earth, and before any plant of the field had sprung up, because Yahweh God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no human being to cultivate the ground." Okay, so right away we're seeing something a little bit different, right? Okay, I hope you are. If you're not, we can talk about it in a minute. "But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground, when Yahweh God formed the man of dust from the ground, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And Yahweh God caused to grow from the ground every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, along with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now a river flowed out from Eden that watered the garden, and from there it diverged and became 4 branches. The name of the first is the Pishon. It went around all the land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stones are there. And the name of the second is Gihon. It went around all the land of Cush. And the name of the third is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria, and the 4th river is the Euphrates. And Yahweh God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. And Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, From every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die. Then Yahweh God said, It is not good that the man is alone. I will make for him a helper as his counterpart. And out of the ground Yahweh God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and he brought each to the man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called that living creature was its name. Fred. No. And the man gave names to every domesticated animal, and to the birds of heaven, and to all the wild animals. But for the man there was not found a helper as his counterpart. And we'll get into this a little bit, but the word helper is a really, really stupid translation. And Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. While he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh where it had been. And Yahweh God fashioned the rib which he had taken from the man into a woman, and brought her to the man. And the man said, She is now bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken from man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cling to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And the man and his wife, both of them were naked, and they were not ashamed. And then we don't need to go into the fall just yet. We can talk about that later. Okay, so obviously there are some differences in the two narratives. And right away there's a big difference in the fact that whoever authored this story is familiar with the idea of cultivation of land. Right? Because that's right there in 2:4. It says there wasn't a man to cultivate the land. That means they're familiar with the process of cultivating land. Okay, and so we kind of know when that happens in human history, when they moved from pastoral to agrarian societies, and when they became more geared toward agriculture rather than animal husbandry. And so that kind of dates this later than the creation of the world. Like, obviously it wasn't written a long time before land cultivation. Okay? That's all I'm saying here. It's not as ancient as we might think. Ancient for us, but not as ancient as the human experience. Let's put it that way. Now again, in the day that Yahweh God made earth and heaven, before any plant was on the earth and before any plant of the field, because Yahweh had not caused it to rain. So there's all this understanding of what happens for plants to grow. Right? It has to rain and the land has to be cultivated. And it's like, so that means that we're forward in history from people who just kind of were nomadic and didn't really settle. Okay. A stream rises from the earth and waters the whole face of the ground. And, that's dew. That's how they're explaining what dew is. Stream waters and, it's like it rises from the earth. Well, kind of. But you'll note, too, that it's Yahweh God in this whole section, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what Genesis 1:1 says. Okay, or toward the beginning, or in a place not far from here, not long ago in a place not far from here. Or not once upon a time. I think that's too fictional. But that's kind of the idea. It's not meant to be, and so it happened. It's not literal, this is what happened history. It's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Well, it's Elohim that does all the work in Genesis 1:1. There does Yahweh enter the scene. And then in Genesis 2:4, all of a sudden, these are the generations of heaven and earth, when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and heaven. Okay, so if you have it in like a regular version, it'll say the Lord God, right? And those are two different words, and the first one is Yahweh, and the second one is Elohim. And so everywhere in Genesis 2 that you see this, you see, and Yahweh Elohim did this, and Yahweh Elohim did that, and Yahweh Elohim did this. So it's the Elohim Yahweh. It's that one. So some ancient scholars said Genesis 1 is what's going on, Genesis 2 is the clarification of things. That's how they worked around the fact that they're different. Okay? There are ones who have said Genesis 1 is the creation of things and Genesis 2 is the separation of things. So it's just God creating, and in Genesis 2 we find out which God created. Okay, these are kind of like ancient interpretations and old ways to look at this. And modern scholarship might say something more like, well, there's two separate authors. We think that's probably a little more accurate to what's going on here. There's two different authors making different points about the same event that they're looking back at in their history. Okay? And in this one, we tend to think more that it's a priestly writer. So later on in Israel's history, when there are priests, this is a priestly hand coming back in and clarifying just who this God is, and also setting up some distinctions and some hierarchy in the way that things are made. Woman is created from man instead of male and female created at the same time, right? And so there's some things going on that are a little different. So here, when Yahweh God formed the man of dust from the ground, he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. And so this is like, okay, so heaven and earth are made, and then man is made. And in Genesis 1, it says all this other stuff is made, and then man is made last. So it's not even just different, it's like it backwards. It starts at the end. Okay? So if we're going to be strict literalists and say the Bible is inerrant and mean it in the way that most people mean that, like Genesis 1 and 2 keep you from doing that. You've obviously never read the two of these side by side if you think that. Because in an instance where it says that on the sixth day this happened, and the next one says early this happened and not the last thing, one of them is right and one of them is wrong if both are historically factual, right? Or both make that claim. Let's put it that way. So we kind of get meted, I guess that is a word, but not what I need here. We kind of get met right out the door of reading the Bible with disagreement. They don't tell the same story in the same way, these two stories. They actually disagree with each other. Not that this is necessarily a key point in all human history, that whether man was created first or last in the created order, but they don't agree. And we're kind of left with, well, okay, what do we do with that? If we're going to hold to this, like, oh, well, the Bible's totally inerrant. Cool. Start with Genesis 1 and start reading it. Let me know what you think. Probably not going to work. So then, when Yahweh God formed the man of dust from the ground, he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. So this is man is formed of the Adam is formed of the Adamah. The red man is formed of the red earth. Okay, that's what that means in Hebrew. And so it just is kind of, it's why we look like the color of dirt, which is good evidence that God didn't create Adam white. And I don't mean that to like sound racist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that these people are looking at themselves and they're saying, well, we're that color of that, so we must be formed of that. No, well, maybe, I don't know. But that's kind of the idea. Okay? And he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and you'll notice in Genesis 1, nothing gets the breath of life. They're just kind of like made. And same with Adam and Eve, we want to call them that, male and female. And here, nothing else gets the breath of life, only humanity gets the breath of life. So obviously, this is a phrase that to the authors means something, this breath of life. It has to do with something beyond just your ability to breathe, because animals and trees both breathe too. Even if they didn't know that trees did, they could observe it with animals. Okay, so it's not just the act of breathing. It's something special about humanity. Okay? And then we said this last time, Yahweh God planted a garden in the Eden in the east, and that gives us a referent for where they are when they're writing this. They're west. So it doesn't necessarily mean west of where, but they give us some indication when they talk about these four rivers, and we know where some of these rivers cross, and it's in the kingdom of Babylon. So this is probably post-exile. They're coming back from Babylon's stuff, to repopulate their homeland. And this is why it's a priestly writer, who's already versed in some of the laws of Judaism, which is not the religion of ancient Israel. And I know that's confusing, and we can break that down. Well, let's just do that. Abraham, his father is Eber, and from Eber come the Hebrew people. It's a morphological working of his name. Okay, so that means that not only Abraham, but anybody that he was brother or sister with, their children are Hebrew people. Okay, and Hebrew is also a language. And it's heavily like Canaanite language influenced by Aramaic and kind of becomes its own thing. So there's a linguistic trail you can take there. But the Hebrew people make up much more than just the nation of Israel. Okay, does that make sense? Because the children of Eber are technically the Hebrew people. And that includes Abraham, all of his siblings, and all of their offspring. Okay, and the children of Abraham were many, but one of them was Isaac. Okay, and Isaac has a kid, and that one that we have a big story about, Jacob. But he also has a brother, Esau. Okay, so that means that the Edomites who come from Esau and the Israelites who come from Jacob are both Hebrew people. Okay? And that also means that by the time we get down to Judaism, Judah is one tribe from among 12 tribes of Israel, which is one brother from two brothers of one guy who is one kid of some kids of another guy. You see how it plays out? Okay, so not everything like... Let's do this the easiest way we can. Modern Israel has nothing to do with ancient Israel. Okay, they're not the same people. Ancient Israel was obliterated by Assyria. They were completely wiped off the map. The people were dispersed, and no one ever heard from them again. They're gone. Okay, what came back from the Babylonian exile, which happens after Assyria, is people from Judah and Levi, and they call it the half-tribe of Manasseh. So it's a couple of tribes that come back. Everyone else is gone. And the religion of one of those tribes is Judaism. Okay, and so it's like a refined, more legal form of worship of Yahweh. So it's the same deity that ancient Israel worshipped, but it's a religion that's not what ancient Israel necessarily followed. They were Yahwists. They could worship God on any mountain, right? In fact, God probably was the mountain at some point. And so there's a big trail there. Oh, and in the midst of all this, Semitic comes from Noah's son Shem. And the Semitic people, according to the flood narrative, right? Shem went one way, Ham went another way. The Hamitic peoples inhabited Africa. The Semitic peoples inhabited this upper Levant area. The Mideast is what we call it now. And so there are a lot of people groups incorporated in these titles that we use. And so it's anti-Semitic, well, some maybe, but not really. And you need to understand that Palestinian people are Semitic too, and so are Israelis. And so it's it can be a weird thing to get in the mix of all that. And all that to say, when we're reading all this stuff, we need to keep these segregations and separations in mind. Because sometimes things are written by different groups than we think are writing. And this happens with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is thought to be written by the kind of northern kingdom Elohim worshipers, and Genesis 2 is thought to be written by the southern kingdom of Judah, Yahweh, Judaism, priestly idea of things worshipers. Okay, and it reflects in how they talk about their God. You know, the ways in which God approaches humanity are different for the different schools. So, anyhow, if God planted a garden in the east, then, like I said, it's a good indication that they're in the west, and if they're in the west, it's a good indication that they are at least at some stage returning or returned from the exile in Babylon. Okay? And so that gives us, it doesn't give us a concrete date of authorship, but it does give us some idea as to when this is happening. So then Yahweh God caused to grow from the ground every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food. And it's that follows Genesis 1. That's good. We agree on that point. And then all of a sudden, and the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, along with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Wait a second. Now, what is that all about? And you'll notice that there's no explanation for what these are. It's just expected that you would know what the tree of life is. And what the tree of the knowledge, it's those trees, those ones we know about. Right? That'd be like us saying, and Plymouth Rock was in the midst of the garden. Without giving any well, what is Plymouth Rock? Well, we all know what it is. Or the Liberty Bell. I don't need to give you but you know what? Someone who doesn't know American history is going to be what's the Liberty Bell? So there's this no explanation given means it's a kind of common knowledge. Okay? And then we aren't going to worry about all of the rivers and the lands and all that because that's another geography. It positions them geographically somewhere close to Judah, which is return from exile time. So then Yahweh God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and to keep it. So here we've got man is created, but not necessarily in the same place where everything else is. And then he's put in this garden to be a gardener. Well, I mean, the idea of a gardener is very late in history, like very recent in world history. You know, the idea of someone whose sole job is to tend to food plants. That's not something that very, 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 very ancient people talked about. Okay, they didn't do that. They didn't have this job. So then he says, oh, by the way, remember how I said every tree was good for eating? Not really. There's this one. It's everything is good. Oh, but wait, I forgot about that one. It's a good thing you didn't go munching before I clarified this, because you could have really screwed things up if you had eaten both of them. But the one you're not supposed to eat from is the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, and this gives us some kind of insight into, and when I talk about theology in the Old Testament, there's no unified theology in the Bible. There are multiple theologies presented. And there are points where they agree, and there are points where they disagree. And that's just kind of how it works. Okay? And what's going on here is some theological import. And the author is saying, hey, look, it is not good for humans to be the one to determine what is good and what is evil. Woe unto you who call what is light dark and what is dark light. Right? Why? Because only God is qualified to do that. And so this is a later theological advancement that Israel comes to. Okay, that it comes around later on, and Isaiah is probably a good time frame for it, which is also pretty close to Babylon. Okay, so everything is kind of like pushing it that direction as far as when things are written. And I know this sounds boring, but it's important. And then God says, it's not good that the man is alone, I'll make for him a helper. And the word helper there is stupidly translated unless we understand what helper is and who is typically called helper in the Old Testament. Okay? It's God. God is our Ezer, our helper. So Ezer only means helper in as much as it means savior. You know what I'm saying? So she's not created as a submissive housewife. She's actually created as somewhat of a savior. Like he needs to be saved from being alone. Okay? It's so, and we don't have that issue in this church, but again, like how texts get interpreted do damage. And when we deconstruct the text and we see, look, like this text has been used over and over and over and over to justify complementarian relationships in the home, and to justify the abuse of women, and to justify women not being able to do the same thing. It's like it's dumb. It's not even in the language. You know, she's not there to raise your kids while you have a job or vice versa. You know, you're there to save each other from being alone, because it's not good that man is alone. You know, it's not good for people to be alone. So be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth so that there are other people. You know, and I find it interesting that here in this particular narrative, God says that man is alone when man has animals, nature, and God. You know, and I think a lot of times, oh, well, all you need, just go out into nature and be alone, and you'll find God. And it's like, well, God said that wasn't good. And I'm not talking about like marriage and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying, like, we need people around us and in relationship with us, and that's because God is relational. Right? This is the incarnation. God is relational. You know, and this is Trinitarian theology, that forever, before, and in time past and time future, God will be relational. Okay? So out of the ground, God formed every beast of the field and bird of the sky, and he brought each to the man to see what he would call it. And a lot of this stuff is, like I said last time, what scholars will call ideological. Well, they'll say, well, this is here to tell us why we have what we have today. Like, Why is that camel called a camel? Well, because Adam said so. And so God brought the animals to Adam, and which is weird to me because God creates light by saying light, and then he creates animals by saying animals, but like they're different, and they're like there's a bunch of them, right? It's not like there's like 8 animals. Like well, maybe God only created like a dozen and then was just let it go and crossbreeding, and now we've got millions, who knows. So Yahweh caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man while he slept. He took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh where it had been. And we've all heard the dumb story about men have one less rib than women. Thank God that there are scientists who said, well, that's not right, and went ahead and counted and said, no, you're wrong, and now we don't have to worry about that anymore. Because why would that be hereditary if you lost a bone? Anyways. So God fashions this rib into woman and brought her to the man, and the man said, she's now bone from my bones, flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken from man. And therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cling to his wife, and they shall be as one flesh. And the man and his wife, both of them were naked, and they were not ashamed. Hallelujah, amen. I told Gabby this should be our marriage verse, but she didn't like that. So here, and I mentioned this last time, just kind of looking at this a little bit critically, if a man leaves his father and mother, and he's the first created man and does not have father and mother, then what is he talking about? He doesn't have kids yet. He doesn't have parents. He doesn't know what father and mother are. Okay? There's no possible way that this could be what Adam really said. And what is he like? I mean, if you could break down every word of this little statement, a man shall leave, where is he leaving? I mean, this implies there's like a place of residence, correct? Okay. His father and his mother, who are they? And shall cling to his wife. What is a wife? This is all prior to all this stuff having been created, invented, or initiated. And they shall be as one flesh. What does that mean? And the man and his wife, both of them were naked, and they were not ashamed. So all of this speaks to a much, much, much later time of authoring. Okay, when marriage is an institution. When the way that you get married is to leave your mother and father's tent and to go start your own tent with your new wife. Okay? And to live as one flesh, and that whole idea is way, way, way later. So that's like Leviticus, which is later. It's even later in our Bible. So if we're unfamiliar with the Bible, we won't even know what they're talking about if we're just reading Genesis 1 and 2. We'll say, oh, okay. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be one flesh? Does that, and there's discussion about that later. And we've got time, so let's go into 3 just a little bit and talk about the fall. And then next week, I'm going to do what I did this week. We'll go back and we'll review a little bit. I'll correct any errors I made. We'll look at some of the Hebrew, but then we'll also talk about why this is important in the context of the return from exile. Okay? So now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal which Yahweh God had made. He said to the woman, did God indeed say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, well, if I read Genesis 1 and not Genesis 2, yes. From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, nor shall you touch it, lest you surely die. And Dad's done a good job talking about how Eve takes the prohibition and adds to it. And this is also a good example for biblical scholars to talk about which text is earlier, the shorter one, because God said, don't eat it. And Eve goes on and creates a new text and says, don't eat it or touch it. And this is what we do. And we keep adding to the story. And it's like, well, and then also, don't even look at it. And don't smell it. And don't let your kids play under it. And, there's like all these. And then we go, oh, but no, now we're going to metaphorize. I like that word. Now we're going to metaphorize everything. And we're going to say that every time you say anything about anyone's behavior, you're just eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. No, that's dumb. Okay. That was off topic, but it was dumb. But the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you shall not surely die, for God knows that on the day you both eat from it, then your eyes will be opened, and you shall both be like gods, knowing good and evil. You shall both be like gods. Okay? What does this imply? That at least at some point, there is the idea that there is more than one divinity. Okay, so the idea that Israel is strictly monotheistic all the time doesn't bear out in the way that they write their scriptures. Okay, they have a pantheon of deities that they're working out of from Canaan. And we can do history later, but it's an evolution of faith and of spirituality in the Bible. Okay, it's not set in stone from the beginning to the end. Things evolve, and that's a good thing. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to make one wise, then she took from its fruit and she ate, and she gave it also to her husband with her, and he ate. And what I want to say has been said before. Why doesn't Adam say anything when the snake is talking? He's just standing there. Some interpreters have said that's because Adam is the snake. And Adam has already been deceived by the serpent within himself. And there is an old legend, I guess, is the best way to say it, about serpent brain and how hisses and whispers become anthropomorphized into beings. And so the idea here would be that Eve heard a whisper on the wind, and they just called it a serpent because they hiss, right? But that whisper could be Adam, who doesn't speak up. Okay, I'm not saying that that's where I sit. I'm just saying that's an interpretation for this. And it's one that does, you can see it in the text, it kind of is there, right? I tend more towards the idea that what is being said here is to undergird the patriarchal society of Israel. And I don't mean patriarchy like we throw the word around today. I mean patriarchal like women were pieces of meat and objects. Okay, different. And they're trying to give a reason for that. Why? Because of the serpent. And Paul even latches onto this in the New Testament. Oh, Eve was deceived first. So this isn't just an Old Testament issue when we get into this stuff. And so, again, this is where Derrida helps us, and we see, there's been a power structure built here. Because Eve was deceived. And so therefore women are this, that, or the other thing. They're lesser, they're weaker, and for this one, this is why they have pain in childbirth. Why does it hurt so bad to bring life into the world? Well, we have a reason, because y'all screwed up. Like if God really wanted to teach us a lesson, he would have made men give birth. Right? He'd have been like, okay, you guys are in for it. But conveniently, it worked out the most biologically convenient way for both sexes, right? A woman's body is kind of primed to carry a baby, and man isn't, or deliver one, for that matter. And so that's cool, but we like to offer reasons for things when we don't know why. And Israel is no different. Why is it so painful? Because you guys ate of the tree before we did. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made for themselves coverings. I don't know why figs matter there, other than I do know that the New Testament writers like to play on that when Jesus curses the fig tree. Okay, whether Jesus ever actually cursed a fig tree or not, I don't know. But the New Testament authors are very, very creative in how they handle the Old Testament. And that's one of the ways they do it. Oh, Jesus cursed that. But how? By cursing an actual tree, because he couldn't eat. Oh, so if something didn't feed him, it was deserving of being cursed. Okay. That's like the Moabites in Deuteronomy 23. Okay. And instead, he curses the fig. But anyways. Then they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden at the windy time of day. It's like 4 p.m. And the man, that was a really bad joke, but nobody laughed. God. Like, really? Oh, it's 4 p.m. Okay, no, that was a joke. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden, and Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" Okay, so they hear the sound of Yahweh walking in the garden. That means that there is physicality to the being. It is not merely a wind. Okay, it's not a spirit hovering. It is a being walking, crunching leaves and sticks, and they hear him. And again, like I said, I don't know what the windy time of day was. Let's see if there's a note here. No. But wind is ruach, and that's also the word for spirit. And so there's some play going on here with the language that they're using. And the man and his wife, again, why is it called a wife if it's a creation narrative and there hasn't been a ceremony or a macha, and a step on the glass and end the wedding thing? Because that's a later tradition. They hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden, and the Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" So, again, how do we take this? Is God being silly? Or can we say that at least at one point in the evolution of the theology of Israel, God doesn't know everything? He's not omniscient in this particular story. Boy, that got quiet. I'm not saying that this is necessarily where I land on my own personal theology, but what I am saying is that according to this story, the text says that God doesn't know. And Adam replies, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I'm naked, so I hid myself." And then he asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I forbade you to eat?" And the man replied, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave to me from the tree, and I ate." Who stole the cookie from the cookie jar, right? You guys remember that old song? And you go around the circle and say everybody's name. And like, "Not me, couldn't be, then who?" And you blame everyone else. It's called the scapegoat game, and we do it today still. Except for now we have televised victim Olympics where the best victim gets the highest reward. And the man replied, "The woman whom you gave to be with me," Adam's the original victim, "she gave to me from the tree and I ate." Then Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" So immediately God believes the story of the man. Again, this lets you know who's writing. Ain't a woman. It's a man. Okay? I'm not being facetious here, I'm being serious. God believes the story of a man because the man is writing. So God says, "What is this you have done?" The woman says, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." So, and this is Gerard loves this story because this is where we get our first instance of scapegoating, and it's already just in chapter 2 of Genesis. And in the oldest stories of human history, we find the scapegoat mechanism at work in humanity. Even if it's just literature, they recognized it and wrote about it. Okay? And it's, "What did you do?" "It wasn't me. And this is my house." You ever seen the Family Circus comic strip, the old one, where the dad, "Who did this?" "Not me." And there's this little invisible guy named Not Me that runs around the house, right? That's my house, trust me. "Who did this?" "Not me." All 7 of them. "Not me, I don't know." Even the baby's "Meh." Because it's human nature to want to blame someone else when things aren't the way they should be for us. Okay? And especially when we get caught. But it happens when things aren't the way they should be for us. And it doesn't mean that we're wrong in how we think, in the should, right? We're not wrong for thinking things shouldn't be this way. What's wrong is trying to find out the reason. Because inevitably the reason becomes an individual, and we understand that individuals are not the source of the problems in the world. We do not wage war against flesh and blood, against every principality and power, and those are the things that, especially for Christians, that we're supposed to be identifying, okay? Not the ists, but the isms. That's a better way to put it. So the serpent deceives her. And then Yahweh God says to the serpent, because you've done this, you'll be cursed. More than any domesticated animal, more than any wild animal, on your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. So here we have the folklore reason for why snakes are on their belly. And that really, I think, is the entirety of the purpose of why the snake is introduced in this story. I think it is solely to discuss why the snake crawls on its belly in the hot desert. Because it's cursed. It's hot down there. It's dirty. And why is it cursed? Oh, well, because way back, this happened. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then the serpent talked. And wait, snakes talk? Well, they used to. No, it's just a tale meant to give us a reason for all the things we see right now. I don't mean us personally, I mean Israel coming back from exile. Okay? And I will put hostility between you and between the woman, and between your offspring and between her offspring. He will strike you on the head, and you will strike him on the heel. Now, this is obviously very poetically applied to Jesus, and I think rightly it's applied to Jesus, but I don't necessarily think that when the author of Genesis sat down to get this story written down, they were thinking about Jesus. Because this is thousands of years before him. And I think that there is some other stuff going on here, and I'm going to consult some of my commentaries to see, but I think it has to do more with deities of nations that have enslaved, imprisoned, or otherwise been bad to Israel. Okay. And then again, here we go. To the woman he says, I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bear children, and your husband shall be your desire, and he shall rule over you. So this is them given the reason for why things are the way they are, why we need to return to our homeland from exile and live in such a way as to emulate ancient Israel. Right? Patriarchal. And we still do this today. It's just that we use these texts for our justification of ruling over others, and they just did too. And to Adam he said, because you listened to the voice of your wife and you ate from the tree which I forbade you to eat, the ground shall be cursed on your account, in pain shall you eat from it all the days of your life, and thorns and thistles shall sprout for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground, for from it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay, and so this whole thing is giving us the reason why we have to farm so hard to get a little food. Again, not us, them. I'm putting us as we are returning from exile. And why we have to work so hard is because we screwed up. Why it isn't easy like God said. This is the land that's flowing with milk and honey, remember? And they have to work by the sweat of their brow to eat. Why? Well, because that woman you gave me. And the man named his wife Eve because she was mother of all life. And Yahweh God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin, and he clothed them. And, some people have taken this and said, see, God initiates the first sacrifice to atone for the sin. Says nothing about atonement here. This has to do with the fact that they were ashamed. And here's why our ancestors wore animal skins, kids. Because they were naked, and God said animal might last longer than fig. A fig leaf is probably going to dry up and go away pretty quickly, but an animal skin will remain. And that's probably better fashion sense. You don't want to go flashing the neighbors. So then Yahweh God said, look, the man has become like one of us. Okay, now here is one where the us is interesting. Okay, because we have this separation of Yahweh God. When it's just Elohim, that's a plural word, so it's kind of like grammatically you would expect them to use plurality when they use verbs. Let us do this, let us do that, we, that kind of stuff. But when you have Yahweh God, that's a particular deity. That's a being. And he says, man has become like one of us. Who is he talking to? The text doesn't say, and this is a big discussion. Is God talking to the Trinity? If you're a Trinitarian, yeah. He's talking to Jesus and the Holy Spirit. If you're an ancient Israelite, no. He's talking to the pantheon of deities that are around him. And this is something that we've got to get a hold of with ancient Israel, is that there are multiple deities, they just worship one. Okay, so they're monolatrous, meaning they worship one deity, but they believe the others exist. Okay, and this is why have no other gods before me is a legitimate command, because there are other gods. And this isn't metaphorical, don't make football what you do on Sundays. This is, don't worship other gods because they exist. So when we're reading this stuff, it's very important to look at this somewhat critically and say, who is he talking to when he says, like mankind has become like one of us, knowing both good and evil? So that means all the deities in this council that he's talking to know good and evil. They know what is right. And they know what is evil. Right? That's what God says here. They know it. Which would be why later on we find God being so harsh when he judges the nations. And see, we think when we read the Old Testament and we see God judging and being violent, we don't like that, especially as grace people. So what we try to do is we go in and we redefine all the words like judgment and wrath and anger. And we say, oh no, that's not really God. He's not angry, he's not wrathful, he's not judgmental. Well, actually, in the stories, God is pissed. And he is killing people. And he is wiping nations off the earth. But the idea behind all of this is that God is furious with the gods of other nations. Not the people. It's the gods. Because they've let people worship them instead of directing worship toward him. Right? And so it's kind of like mini Satans, right? Like a bunch of them. And so Yahweh disinherits all these peoples in Deuteronomy, and he only inherits Israel. He's like, fine, you know what? Since this group is the one who's going to worship me alone, they're my people. And so it's not that God chose them as much as they said okay to him. Okay, and so I'm not trying to set up a theology right now. What I'm trying to do is say the Bible says some things that we don't really wrestle with. And we don't like to wrestle with. We don't like the idea that ancient Israel believed that there were other deities that existed in the heavens. And so what we do is we say, have no other gods before me means don't exalt anything to the level of God. No, it doesn't. It means don't worship Ra. And don't worship Yom. And don't worship Shemesh. And don't worship Asherah. Worship Yahweh. That's what it means. And so here, when we've got this happening, becoming like us, we have God talking to other deities. Okay? In their understanding of how the cosmos works, and how deities work, and how Elohim work. There are other beings that qualify as Elohim. Okay? Yahweh is an Elohim, but he's the only Elohim that is Yahweh. Okay? And all the others are Elohim. They're all gods. And angels are called Elohim. And so they exist in a different realm. They're above humanity. It's a bigger picture than just, there's this one God who was bored and alone. It's, there was, this council of gods, and then they had this war, and Yahweh was victorious, and so we worship him. That's more history that we can read later. I'm going to wrap up here. Yahweh God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. Again, this is standing at the viewpoint that we are a society that farms, and here is why. Okay? Which means that it's not written during Abraham's time because they hadn't settled yet. It's not. Lot is a tender of sheep too, and he lives in a city. So I mean, he's still not even a farmer by the time that he's got relatives who are in the land that he's been promised. I mean, it's like, this is a long way down the line. So he drove the man out and placed cherubim east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming, turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life. So, you have this neat little ending to package up this Genesis 2 narrative, that there was a garden where everything was perfect, where cultivation was easy because water came up out of the ground, and the land was easy to work. The plants were there. They were put there by God. But now we have to work this hard, arid, dry, hard to work ground. Why? Well, because Adam. Well, then why don't we just go back to the garden? Oh, but there's an angel. He's guarding it. And so it's set up as a big mythological tale, but there's all of this import that happens with different theologies and different, like I said earlier, different words that are used to talk about these things. And if we look at it in the lens of the return from exile, then what the author or authors are doing here has more to do with resisting oppression than it does to do with telling history. Okay, so how does Israel resist oppression here? They stand up and they say all the stories that you know about the creation of everything are wrong. And we know how it was done. It was done by this God. And so they're standing up inside an oppressive structure and saying, your foundational stories are wrong. You don't even have a right to be here. Because we do, because our God, because we were chosen. And it's a national origin story. It's Israel getting their personhood back after a return from a brutal exile. Okay, they're writing an origin story. And like I said, all throughout, there's little things that we need to look at and see, like they say the word gods for a reason. And they say little things like eastward for a reason, and they talk about specific landmarks for a reason, and there's a reason why specific practices are hinted at, right? It's to undergird why we have this practice now. Well, why do we have marriage? Well, because in the beginning, God made a man and a woman. He made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And we say, and we still do it, right? And this is the justification we give for why you can't be in a committed, loving, same-sex relationship. How stupid. It's not even a literal story. It's meant to be much bigger than that. And we disrespect it by trying to act like it's literal. And I like to use my wife as an analogy all the time with the Bible. I love Gabby so much that just existing with her in the house with me isn't enough. Like, I want to know where she came from. And I want to know what she experienced along the way. And her history. And her own context. And why she responds a certain way to certain things that aren't normal in South Africa that are normal here. Those are things I want to know because I love her. And I want to have a daily experience with her now, as she is, without necessarily having to question all that and break it all down. Okay, so it's both. Well, it seems to me like with the Bible, a lot of times what we do is we just say, oh yeah, no, I've read that. And it's like, oh, I know the Genesis stories. Why is Caleb talking about the Genesis stories? Because you can spend years on just these two stories. And you can break down everything that's being said, and you can start, and all of a sudden what happens is you realize that you actually love the Bible. And not in the way that most Christians say, I love my Bible. And what they mean is, I love it so much I elevate it to perfection, which isn't love. Okay, idolatry is not love. It never is, it never can be. It can't progress to love. It can only ever be idolatry. But when you love something, you want to know why it has that mole. Or why there's that particular blemish. And instead of going, the one side is this hardcore, everything is perfect and inerrant and totally inspired, and you may not contradict the words of Scripture, even though it contradicts itself. And then the other side is this, it's all shit and I'm going to throw it out because it's all stories and made up. I mean, either one of those I think are equally stupid. And I've been on both sides of that. I'm speaking as because I were one. And in many ways still are one. With certain things. But I think when we really say, okay, I love something, I want to know. I want to know why it says what it says. And for me, and not necessarily for everyone else, but for me, I want to know why it says what it says includes I need to know the language it says it in. Because there are all kinds of little things that it's saying in the language that it's written in that don't get pushed over to English, that get theologically clouded because we're trying to make it, some holy scripture instead of just letting it speak and say what it says and learning to deal with the troublesome parts of it. And I like history. So I get a lot like, oh, do you think that history is the only way to look at the Bible? No. I think it's probably the first tool we should use. And we should say, what does the archaeological record say? What do we know from history? What do we know from other cultures? And there are a lot of times, where that question is enough to deal with this so-called troublesome text. Because you realize, this is a social milieu, this is a genre, this is propaganda, this is how they wrote. It's how they embodied their own stories into history, and got them there. They all wrote the same way. Sometimes it's not enough, and sometimes you have to go on and look at things like, well, what word are they using here? Why did they use this Hebrew word? When this one works just as well. Why does God bara when asa works just as well? For making. It means the same thing, basically. And then we can go on to talk about, how does this compare to the literature of the day? Do we know of other stories that are written around the same time? How does it compare? And you start to see some things about what Israel's done to talk about who God is and how God acts with creation. And like I said, right away in Genesis 2, we have this idea that God doesn't know everything. Man, if you really follow that line of thought through the Old Testament, you see that God is presented as very, very human. And image and likeness start to mean something a little different. It's not this ethereal, can't be grasped, oh yes, I'm going to be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. How about be human as your Father in heaven is human? That might work there if you take that specific train of thought and follow it all the way through. This God repents. He changes his mind. He says, well, I was going to do that, but you convinced me, so never mind. He acts upset, he gets jealous, he flies into, he acts like a human. Right? Does that mean that Israel's painted God in their image? Or does that mean that God's created us in his image and likeness? And the reason that we tend to repent and forget and fly off the handle is because we're in the image of God. So we can follow all this through and we can make some interesting statements. I'm more concerned with what it says and how we interpret what it says. And I think that the interpretive side needs to happen as a group. I think what it says happens with people who can read what it says. You're here's the word for this, and here's the, and you can't ever say literal because that's not going to work. But finally, I think what I want to do, this book is kind of thick, but it's a really, really good introduction / first year on how to read the Bible. And it's by a guy named James Kugel, and he's an Orthodox Jew. And it's all about the Old Testament. So the Bible to Jews is just the Old Testament, right? So this is all about the Old Testament, and he breaks down how ancient interpreters saw these texts a lot of times and how modern scholars have come to view them. So you get both. And I think what you'll find is in our modern so-called Christianity, a lot of what we believe and a lot of what we think these texts are saying is based in old interpretations of things. Okay, and one of them I want to do here, and then we'll close up. Oh no, I just pulled my place marker out here. So, yeah, here we go. In this story, you get, in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Right? And there's been a lot of discussion about what is this day. Because Adam didn't die right away. Right? He lived on for 900-something years beyond this. And then he expired. Okay? And so the way that a lot of ancient interpreters interpreted this, and by ancient interpreters I mean actual Bible authors, right? Because they rework their own texts. And this is why it's important to learn what it says in some of the older parts of our Bible, because the rest of the Bible is interpretive work with those texts. Okay, so Psalm 90 verse 4 says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are as yesterday, the way it passes or like a watch in the night." Meaning, 1,000 years are as a day. Right? That's in the New Testament too. It's in 2 Peter 3:8. "But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day." And then the letter of Barnabas 15 says, "For with him a day signifies 1,000 years." And so then we get kind of where these guys got this from, right? Because in the day you eat of it, you're going to die, translated to almost 1,000 years. So a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. So then people started to interpret that and say that means creation took place over 7,000 years. Right? And we get this young earth theory that arises out of that. And we get people who are famous now for misreading the Bible and have big theme parks. Jubilees, which is an ancient, we call it apocryphal, but it's not. Adam died and he lacked 70 years of 1,000 years. 1,000 years are as a single day in the testimony of heaven. Therefore it was written concerning the tree of knowledge, on the day that you eat of it, you will die. And those are all scriptures that talk about Genesis and the day being 1,000 years. And then there's like church fathers talk about this. And then the New Testament talks about this. And it's like, oh, you start to see what a little bit of interpretation can do to generations of theological discussion. Just by making the claim that because God said on the day you eat of it, it didn't translate into a 24-hour day, people began to we have to write excuses for why things don't look the way that the text says they should look. So we add to it, and we write an excuse, and we write a commentary, and we add to it, and we just keep going. And Israel did the same thing, and all of a sudden they've got prophetic books, and they've got law books, and they've got history books, and they've got wisdom books, and all these are all based in this stuff and why things either did or didn't happen the way that it said they were gonna. And we get all the way forward to the New Testament, and they do the exact same thing with Jesus. And they use all these stories that they know, and they oh yeah, well we have this story and this story and this story and this story, but there is a name that is above all other names, and that name is Yahweh. We don't say that name, and they're like, no, but God has given him the name above all other names. And so they begin to say, well, yeah, all those stories we told about God, yeah, that's God, but he became a man. And they use the Old Testament to talk about God becoming a man and to frame his life and to tell his story, right? So this is why it's important. This is why I've kind of latched onto it. So next week what we'll do is we'll take Genesis 2 and we'll hit some key points again. We'll talk a little bit about the Hebrew, and then we'll do some scholarly stuff on why this is all such a slap in the face of Babylon and why that's incredibly brave for them to have written at the time that they wrote this. I know, you're ready to go. You're dismissed.